How did ancient humans treat war prisoners? It's roughly 13,000 years ago, somewhere along a stretch of the Nile Valley, now called Jebel Sahaba, in modern-day Sudan. You're crouched behind a low ridge of sandstone, and your hands are shaking, not from cold, but from adrenaline. You've been running for maybe 2 miles. Behind you, smoke rises from what used to be your camp. In front of you, a group of men from a rival band are spreading out in a line, and they're not slowing down. This isn't a skirmish. This is what archaeologists now believe might be one of the oldest documented war massacres in human history. No Geneva Convention, no white flag, no customer service line to call. Just you, a group of strangers who want you gone, and a decision they're about to make about whether you get to live past sunset. It's the kind of decision that, today, would get someone arrested, sued, and probably cancelled within the hour. Back then, it was Tuesday. Here's the thing that should stop you cold. This wasn't a myth, a legend, or a campfire exaggeration. It's buried in the ground, literally. Skeletons at this site show embedded stone projectile points, healed and unhealed fracture wounds, and clustering patterns that suggest coordinated, repeated violence over generations. Not a single chaotic brawl. So the question that actually matters here isn't did ancient humans go to war? We know they did. The real question is this. When ancient humans won a fight, what happened to the people on the losing side? Did they get taken prisoner, enslaved, ransomed? Or did prisoner of war not really exist yet, and losing simply meant dying? Here's the part that tends to catch people off guard. We like to imagine prehistoric warfare as small, almost polite, 2 guys with spears having a disagreement, and then everyone goes home. The evidence says otherwise. At sites like Jebel Sahaba, and others we'll get to, archaeologists aren't finding evidence of restraint. They're finding evidence of near total elimination. Entire clusters of skeletons, men, women, children, all showing violent trauma, buried together, with no separate group of spared individuals nearby. In some early human conflicts, there doesn't appear to have been a prisoner category at all. You won, or you were erased. Let that sit for a moment. By the end of this video, you're going to understand why the entire concept of a prisoner of war wasn't some given of human nature. It was an invention. One that shows up unevenly, across different ancient cultures, for very different reasons. Some practical, some horrifying, some frankly business-minded. You'll see how the fate of a captured enemy could range from adoption into the family that just orphaned you, to decades of slavery, to being kept alive for one specific, ritual purpose that will make your stomach turn. Let's go. Most people, if you stopped them on the street and asked, what happened to prisoners of war in ancient times, would probably say something like, they got enslaved, and leave it at that. It's the default assumption, mostly because that's the version pop culture gave us. Chains, auction blocks, Roman galleys. Except that's only one branch of a much weirder tree. Turns out, what happens to you when you lose wasn't a single universal rule ancient humans all agreed on. It was closer to a menu, and which option got picked depended on the culture, the era, what was the economy, and sometimes just the mood of whoever was in charge that week. Some cultures didn't take prisoners at all, full stop, because feeding an extra mouth in a resource-scarce environment made 0 sense. Other cultures took prisoners specifically because they needed labor, or needed to replace lost population, or needed something far darker. The real story isn't one answer. It's at least 5 different answers, and they get progressively more uncomfortable. Let's start at the beginning, because the earliest evidence we have suggests option 1 on the menu was brutally simple. No prisoners at all. Back to Jebel Sahaba for a second. Researchers led by teams building on the original 1960s excavation by Fred Wendorf have re-examined more than 60 skeletons from this site, many bearing multiple stone tool wounds, some individuals struck over a dozen times. Not metaphorically, literally over a dozen separate impact points on a single body. That's not an accident during a hunting mishap. That's what forensic anthropologists call overkill. A level of violence that goes way past what's needed to simply stop someone. And here's the detail that reframes the whole picture. There's no evidence of a separate group nearby who was captured and kept. The people on the losing side of whatever happened at Jebel Sahaba weren't marched off anywhere. Theory number 1, and the leading one right now, is that this represents systematic, repeated conflict between two competing groups, fighting over shrinking resources as the Sahara dried out around them, with no economic or social incentive to keep the losers alive. When food is that scarce, an extra prisoner isn't a resource. It's a threat, and a mouth you can't afford to feed. Case 2, and this one's arguably even more chilling because of how intimate it is. The Talheim Death Pit, in what's now southwestern Germany, dated to around 7,000 years ago, tied to the early farming linear pottery culture. In 1983, construction workers dug up a mass grave containing at least 34 individuals, men, women, and children, all showing blunt force skull trauma from stone adzes, essentially the farming tools of the day repurposed as weapons. Think about that for a second. Not spears, not arrows, tools. The prehistoric equivalent of someone grabbing a hammer from the garage because it's what? As on hand. Bioarchaeological analysis found that this wasn't random violence from bandits passing through. Isotope and genetic studies suggest these were people from the same regional community, possibly even a single settlement wiped out entirely, likely by a neighboring group in a single coordinated raid. Again, no captives found separately. No evidence anyone was kept as a prisoner. The whole community was simply removed from the map. So why bring up two sites that both say, no prisoners? Because it sets up the real twist. As human societies got more complex, agriculture spread, and populations grew larger and more hierarchical, the just kill everyone model started to look, from a purely economic standpoint, wasteful. And that's where things shift. Case 3, the Assyrian Empire, roughly 900 to 600 BCE, specifically the reign of King Ashurbanipal, whose palace reliefs, now housed largely in the British Museum, are essentially ancient propaganda posters carved in stone. And they do not hide the ball. These reliefs depict captured enemy soldiers being led away in chains, tongues pierced, some being flayed alive, others simply enslaved and put to work on massive infrastructure projects. Canals, palaces, roads. Here's a wild number for scale. Some Assyrian royal inscriptions boast of deporting entire populations, tens of thousands of people at a time, resettled hundreds of miles from their original homeland, as a deliberate strategy to break their ability to rebel. This wasn't chaos. It was policy. The Assyrians essentially invented an early version of mass forced relocation as an administrative tool, the prehistoric equivalent of a government relocation program, except with none of the paperwork and all of the whips. Prisoners here weren't valuable because someone felt merciful. They were valuable as labor and as a message, resist us, and this is what happens to your entire town. Case 4 takes us to the Eurasian steppe and the Scythians, described by the Greek historian Herodotus, around 450 BCE. Herodotus, who admittedly wasn't always the most reliable narrator, describes Scythian warriors scalping their enemies, literally, not as a metaphor, and turning the scalps into decorative trophies worn on the bridle of their horse. He also describes some warriors going a step further and turning the skulls of particularly hated enemies into drinking cups, lined in gold if the victim was notable enough. Modern archaeology has actually backed some of this up. Excavated Scythian burial mounds, called kurgans, have produced skulls with cut marks consistent with scalping and cranial modification, matching Herodotus's account uncomfortably well. So here, prisoner wasn't even really the goal. The goal was the kill itself, and the prisoner's body became a status object afterward, the ancient equivalent of a trophy case, except the trophies used to be people who had names, families, and their own version of this exact story, from the other side. And then there's case 5, maybe the one that reframes everything you just heard. The Aztec Empire, and their so-called Flower Wars. Xochiaoyotl. Staged conflicts fought between the Aztec Triple Alliance and neighboring city-states like Tlaxcala, starting around the 1450s. Here's where it gets genuinely strange. These wars weren't primarily fought to kill enemy soldiers on the battlefield. They were fought specifically to capture them alive. Why? Because Aztec religious practice required a steady supply of war captives for ritual sacrifice to sustain what they believed was the ongoing balance of the cosmos. Sacrifices tied to deities like Huitzilopochtli. Spanish chronicler accounts along with the Codex Mendoza, describe capture as the primary battlefield objective, with warriors gaining more prestige for taking a live prisoner than for killing an enemy outright. Do you see how upside down that is compared to everything we just covered? At Jebel Sahaba, killing everyone was the goal. In the Aztec Flower Wars, killing on the battlefield was almost a failure state. The entire war existed to produce prisoners, on purpose, for a specific future use. Let that sink in. So across roughly 13,000 years of human conflict, we go from no prisoners, total elimination, to prisoners as slaves and trophies, to prisoners as the literal point of the war. That's not one universal human behavior. That's 5 wildly different cultural systems, each one shaped by its own economy, religion, and survival math. Now here's where this stops being a fun archaeological trivia dump and starts getting heavier. Because if you sit with case 5 for a second, the Aztec example, you have to reckon with something uncomfortable. For a captured warrior, the mercy of not being killed on the battlefield wasn't mercy at all. It was often a delay. Aztec sources describe captives being kept, sometimes for weeks, sometimes fed and even honored ceremonially, before being led up the steps of a temple for a ritual death that their captors genuinely believed was necessary, even sacred. Imagine knowing, with total certainty, the exact manner and rough timeline of your own death, and being unable to do anything about it except wait. That's not a footnote. That's one of the darker psychological realities buried inside ancient warfare, and it complicates any simple story about who was civilized and who wasn't. The empires with elaborate legal and religious systems around prisoner treatment weren't necessarily kinder than the small bands who killed everyone quickly at Jebel Sahaba. In some ways, the wait might have been crueler. So back to that ridge in the Nile Valley, 13,000 years ago, you crouched behind sandstone with a rival group closing in. How did ancient humans actually treat war prisoners? The honest answer is, inconsistently. And often not at all, because for most of human history, there wasn't a prisoner category. There was a spectrum ranging from instant death, to slavery, to trophy-taking, to being kept alive on borrowed time, for a purpose you'd never choose for yourself. Whether you lived past that afternoon depended less on any universal rule of mercy and more on which specific group of humans found you, and what century, economy, and belief system they happened to belong to. It's worth sitting with, because the instinct to treat the enemy as either fully human or barely human at all didn't go away when spears turned into rifles. Every modern debate about how prisoners of war should be treated, the Geneva Conventions, the POW camps, war crimes tribunals, is really just humanity, still arguing about the exact same. Question those people at Jebel Sahaba, Talheim, Nineveh, and Tenochtitlan were answering with their actions instead of their words. We just write it down now, instead of leaving it in a mass grave for someone to dig up 13,000 years later. So, would you have shown mercy if you were the one standing over the loser? Or do you think, if push came to shove, most of us would end up making the same brutal calculations our ancestors did? Let me know in the comments.